Hello. Hello. Right, so this is a book or two to review. I'm thinking it is number 20. And if you're wondering why I possibly look a little bit strange, it's because, as you know, I'm away running summer courses, and for operational reasons, I am up all night tonight on duty. So, you can always delegate these things down to junior staff, but frankly, that doesn't strike me as the type of boss that's being fair. Especially as if I pull a night, then everyone only has to pull one night. So, Sinking Force Z 1941. As I'm up, I might as well be productive, and I'm going to do some recordings. This is the day the Imperial Japanese Navy killed the Battleship by Angus Konstam, and illustrated by Adam Tooby. Now, this is a lovely Osprey book. And before I even get into it, it's already annoyed me. Here is my point. Air power sinks battleships. Taranto, Moselle Kabir, Bismarck. They're all damaged at various points. There are ones off the coast of Norway that are damaged. There are all sorts of operations where the British are inflicting damage on people, where the Germans are inflicting damage on people, where the Italians are inflicting damage on people, and the British are inflicting damage on the Italians, and the French. And yet, it's only when it's done to the British by the Japanese that's when the battleship dies. And it doesn't. Because people still build battleships. They're still using battleships. It doesn't kill the battleship. And I can't even be annoyed with Angus for it, Konstam, because honestly, it's marketing and everyone does it. And everyone says it. And it's a great book. It's just not right. It's not. It gives you all the various operations going on. It tells you about Hermes, which could have been useful addition to Force Z, but in early December was deployed in the South Atlantic hunting fruitlessly for German raiders, according to this. You sit there and go, well, Hermes isn't normally what I'd think about for Force Z, but what could she carry? Could I operate full Mars from Hermes? No. Sea Gladiators? I'm not sure how much use Hermes would have been. Honestly, I don't think much use. I think you're needing a bigger carrier. Honestly, as I've talked about before, there you go, there's HMS Indomitable. Now, in this book it writes, the illustrious class fleet aircraft Indomitable was supposed to join Admiral Phillips' force as it was sailed for Far East, but she ran aground while working up in the Caribbean. Instead, she was sent to the United States for repairs. Her complement of Sea Hurricanes and Fulmars would have been invaluable to Phillips. It would have been. She'd have been probably have been available, and maybe more carriers would have been available if they hadn't stopped the construction of them. As we know, they pause. And I will be answering those questions from that point later on at some point more fully, but I will say this. The Admiralty itself again advises against pausing of the aircraft carriers because they're part of the anti-submarine warfare program. The pause of the carriers seems more about the government being seen to pause the carriers to focus on the anti-submarine war effort. It's about politics than reality. The shipyards that build the carriers are still building the carriers. They don't. The carrier is still left on the slipway. It's not moved. The personnel that were working on them, more it's a thing of they're being moved off the jobs in case they're needed for repair jobs. And they're not moved into different yards because the little yards which are running and producing the escorts and the corvettes, etc., are not normal naval yards. They're the little merchant industry yards. Interesting scenario though comes about is if Indomitable hadn't been as delayed as she was, she'd been completed earlier, she hadn't had the accidents in the Bahamas, etc., were working up, and she had been out there. As we talked about before, she would have been running an air cap. That could well have been interfacing with the Brewster Buffaloes back in the various land air bases, and it could have been a very different task force they'd have been dealing with. Also, in the nicest way, she'd have probably brought her own escort with her, in that I doubt they would have deployed such a valuable asset without at least one or two anti-aircraft cruisers along, as well as the destroyers that were with the battleships. So it would have been a very different task force the Japanese would have been approaching. They would have had fighters to deal with them, break up their attacks, and intercept their attacks and break up their attacks, and then when they eventually got through, they would have been facing a lot more firepower. The second premise was that due to her expansionist policies from the early 1930s on, Japan was considered the greatest threat to British interests in the Far East. As an ally, though, care was taken not to make the British position in the region so powerful that it would present a strategic threat to Japan. Singapore's defences were therefore deliberately starved of military and air assets. However, the naval base was completed in 1938, and sufficient coastal defences were installed to adequately protect Singapore from any attack from the sea. Incidentally, all but the 15-inch guns, coastal guns, could traverse sufficiently to bombard the landward approaches of Singapore Island, as well as seaward approaches. The problem was, troops and aircraft earmarked for use in Singapore and Malaya were either retained in the UK or else diverted to the Middle East. During World War I, Britain and Japan had been allies, and the two countries enjoyed cordial relations. However, during the late 1920s, cracks began appearing in this unity, as the British came to regard the Japanese as a potential military threat to their interests in the Far East. The naval cuts of the post-war years and the economic slump that followed limited the ability of Britain to maintain extensive military and naval force in the region. Therefore, while Britain relied heavily on India, Australia, and New Zealand for the military support, it also scaled down its own naval presence on the China Station. Unrest in China led to realization that Hong Kong was no longer a secure base in the region, so the British government looked to Singapore as its new bastion in the region. A new naval base was established there, and Singapore Island was fortified, rendering it virtually safe from a seaborne attack. Churchill went so far as to describe it as Gibraltar of the East. The naval base there was finally opened in 1938. Again, it's one of those things that, with Singapore, if they put radar there, and I mean set it up and operated it properly, had some decent fighters there deployed earlier, I managed to find some way to get some Hurricanes probably out there in early to mid 1941. So they'd been out there a few months, managed to establish a decent, well, not chain home level command, but decent coordination of Singapore and probably wider Malaya. They could well have had good air defense. The thing about Force Z and the Far East and all the operations that happened there is that they know what's coming. The Allies are not stupid. The British are not stupid. The British have been waging a naval air war for the past 2 years. They have been attacking ships in harbour, ships at sea with aircraft. They know fully their capabilities. They haven't done more because of the way they've been fighting the operations, because the number of aircraft they've been able to involve. The fact that whilst they had a pre-war doctrine of multi-carrier operations, they haven't actually been able to deploy a multi-carrier force really other than Norway. But even then, they didn't get to act on it. So the British know what to expect. The British are limited by that decision. They're limited by their own aircraft production, which we can blame on the Bolt and Paul Defiant and other turreted fighters, because, as I said, they were a nice idea on paper because of the 360 fire, but that meant you had industrial capacity going to the construction of turreted fighters, which could have gone on more regular fighters, and considering the amount of effort that goes into actually making that turret and fitting it in and complexity, that might have actually increased your fighter production by, I don't know, 3 aircraft for every 2 turreted fighters. Which doesn't sound significant, but it all adds up. It adds up to a few extra squadrons, and that could have made a difference in deployment to the Far East. And it could have been a very useful aircraft squadron to have a couple of squadrons of Hurricanes out there. Again, the decision on the carriers. It's not with hindsight. I'm not saying this with hindsight 2020 going, I am smarter looking back and I know. No, there were reports at the time. And there are people who honestly seem to express the opinion that if Henderson had been at his heights still of his powers, not suffering from his illness, which of course claims him in 1939, and if he'd still been around, therefore, when they make the decision, when World War II begins, the carriers would not have been paused. Or more likely, he would have found a compromise, and not all the carriers would be paused. Now, why does that matter if not all the carriers are paused? Because if not all the carriers are paused, when they decide to surge, oh frick, we've got to actually complete these, they would already have some moving further along, which would mean they would actually be able to speed up the production of the rest of them, instead of trying to get them all out at once. history. You learn a lot by studying the facts and the history and what happens. But you can also learn from the paths not taken. Whatever the reasoning, and I'm sure it was felt to be justified, for stopping the carriers as well as the other capital ships, the battleships, etc., being in production to favour escorts, I am sure is a logical thing. I'm sure there were very cogent papers produced on the subject. I know I've read some of them, I'm sure there were more than those though. However, there are also very cogent papers produced saying, don't do this. So in the end, buck stopped where it stops. And the interesting thing is, it is 4C which suffers. It is the Far East which suffers. Having a carrier with 4C wouldn't have been a panacea. It wouldn't have guaranteed survival. You might have even lost your carrier. But thanks to the experience of the Mediterranean, the British had a very coherent and a very well thought through air defence system for their carriers by that point. So the odds are it wouldn't have costed them the carrier. And then that means you end up with a Far East fleet being formed with this carrier and these two far ships at its core. Think what else gets surged out there? Does Somerville get sent? Does he get overworked still? Or does Phillips stay in command? Phillips is senior enough. Well, there again, though, they might have made Phillips the theatre commander and sent out Somerville to take command of the fleet under him. That could well have been their plan. Who knows? But if 4C doesn't get sunk, and the fleet's still strong, it's hard to see how Singapore falls when it does. Because they still have that lifeline. And it's also viable then to do some more support for Singapore. And whilst I agree with people holding Singapore would be a nightmare and you wouldn't want the fleet based there, because it's a Malta of the Far East scenario and therefore it's very difficult to support, but, and this is the critical point, you hold Singapore, you can hold Java, you can protect Australia, and you can protect India. So it's going to be costly, but I would argue it's even more valuable than actually holding Malta. And if they're prepared to pay the cost to hold Malta because of its value and its strategic value in Mediterranean operations, I cannot imagine that the Americans, Brits, Australians, Indians, and everyone else involved in the Pacific War, Dutch, would not have been prepared to pay the price to hold Singapore if they could. You also then end up with a potential bull run scenario in that the British could keep reinforcing Singapore and the Japanese could keep planning to take Singapore. British could keep planning a break out of Singapore and the Japanese keep planning a break into Singapore. And it could be one of those long-running sagas of World War II. But whatever your opinions, you will not be disappointed if you get this book. You might be annoyed by the title, like I am, but that's not on Angus. That's how they sell 4C. and it's worth a read. It's a good book. Take care.